Welcome to Shenanigans Ensue with
Mary SanGiovanni!
Hi, folks. Welcome back to Cosmic Shenanigans. This is Mary SanGiovanni, and as always, I'm up to shenanigans of cosmic proportions. This week, we are going to continue our Fall of Cthulhu graphic novel exploration here. We are now on part 3, which has been titled The Gray Man. The writer, Michael Allen Nelson. The artist, Mateus Santaluco. Inker, Andre Coelho. Colorist, Arthur Fujita, Chris Peter, Eduardo Medeiros, and letterer, Marshall Dillon. Now, in prior issues, we've seen the agents of Nyarlathotep. We've discussed them at some length in talking about how, despite this being Lovecraftian horror, we have a sense of the personalities almost. We may not understand the motivations because they don't, the gods don't exactly think or feel like we do, but we do see a little bit of their personality and strangely enough, a little bit of the things that they value. And that's going to show up again in the next couple of episodes as well. Now, this issue focuses primarily on an agent of Cthulhu and not Nyarlathotep. Okay, so far, it's strange. If we're taking sides here, we've seen a lot from the point of view of Nyarlathotep's side. But if you remember, the overarching plot here is that there's going to be a war, that Cthulhu is being pitted against the god Nodens, another sea god, kind of, and that ultimately, Nyarlathotep is going to be involved, maybe orchestrating certain things, certain machinations, but that actually Nodens is not the target. Nyarlathotep is, because if you look at Lovecraftian mythology, Nyarlathotep was an elder god. He was their messenger. He was probably as close to human beings as any of them ever actually get. Most elder gods don't even know that we exist. The old ones are pretty aware that we're here. And in some stories, the old ones are children of the elder gods, and other ones they're just somewhat lesser deities, not quite as old, not quite as powerful, but pretty close. And that the elder gods ultimately conquered the old ones and banished them to the far reaches of the universe and the deepest parts of the ocean, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what we have here, Nodens, I think, sort of falls under the old ones category. But the old ones are always kind of looking for revenge. And although you'd think that they wouldn't mess with the elder gods, particularly the messenger of the gods, this seems to be the plan. They seem to want to take down Nyarlathotep for once and for all. But what we're getting now, I think, is more from we're not looking so much at corporate, but actually the people working in the trenches here. And we have a creature who is a demigod, the Gray Man. They call him the Gray Man. And I guess he's on that demigod level like Sisyphus is. The cult, the Cthulhu cult is trying to raise Cthulhu because they're sort of annoyed that anybody would try to go after Cthulhu, and they want Cthulhu to basically kick everybody's ass and be like, hey, we're better than that, we're stronger than that. You can't take us down, basically. So we see a little bit of those cult members. Now, we don't see much of Nyarlathotep's cult members exactly. We see more of his agents, his sort of right-hand men and women. But we do see human cult members who are trying to raise up Cthulhu and also ones who are trying to stop it. But in this particular case, the old one, this demigod, the gray man, is sort of pulling the strings of these cult members here. Now, one of the characters refers to him as a patron saint, which I thought was kind of interesting. He's the patron saint of human sacrifice. But I'd say if we're using a Judeo-Christian framework as an example, I'd say that these demigods are more like angels or demons. Like they're in service to the gods, but they're powerful creatures in and of themselves. Now, we also see a return to Sheriff Dirk. If you remember, Sheriff Dirk was the police officer, the detective, who worked with on that string of murders associated with the character Cy from Part 1. Everywhere Cy went, pretty much, there were dead bodies, and the sheriff was sort of left to clean up the situation. Now, once Cy was committed to a mental institution, Dirk kind of figures, okay, all of this is behind him, but it's not, because what we also get is a B&E. Okay, we have a breaking and entering where a young girl is arrested for having broken into the house of this couple who later turns up dead. She has a very specific purpose, though. Not only in this comic, but it is suggested in a spin-off comic of her own. She's sort of Laura Croft-esque. She's a student of the recently deceased Professor McKinley, who you may remember as being Cy's uncle, who shot himself and sort of kicked off all the events of this entire series. Her name is Lucy Jennifer Inacio das Neves, and they call her Lucifer for short. Now, again, in the presence of this girl, the sheriff is stuck with a trail of death and bodies. But we come to find that this girl, I think, has some more agency than Cy ever did. As a student of Professor McKinley, she's learned some ideas on how to stop this whole situation, from this whole God war from happening. She's only a cog in the wheel, really, but we do get a sense that she has more knowledge about the situation and would prove a pretty powerful ally. The reason the gray man is leaving this trail of destruction on his way to her is that he's after an artifact that's necessary to the ritual of returning Cthulhu. It is an ugly ceremonial dagger, which Lucifer originally stole from an antiques merchant and which Cy's uncle eventually gave to Cy. And you may remember that this is the dagger that throughout issue 1, Cy's girlfriend wants him to get rid of because it's looking at her. There's a face on the handle that keeps looking at her, and it's ultimately the instrument of her death. Now, as far as actual, Lovecraftian symbology and things like that, we've got a lot of cool stuff here. We have symbols. Okay, all Lovecraftian stories, all good Lovecraftian stories have a series of symbols and sigils which basically work to either protect or to summon various entities. And if we can deviate for a moment, I think that it's interesting that, and I may have mentioned this in an early episode on Lovecraft and the actual occult, that Lovecraft's knowledge of the practices of various witchcraft paths was extensive but slightly inaccurate. Okay, in one story, I wish I could. I forget which story it is now. He actually writes out a spell that one of the characters is using, which he says is a summoning spell. And in actual occult magic, it would be a protective spell. It would be calling on certain angels to protect you from whatever it is that you are summoning. So it's part of a summoning spell, but it's really not the actual summoning piece of it. Lovecraft when he did research on occults, he occult stuff. He did a lot of research on witchcraft books, which were written about European witchcraft as it was perceived at the time, which had a sort of satanic bend to it that modern witchcraft analysis has shown is not accurate. So this particular element, this idea of a protective circle, is in there, and it is accurate. If you were dealing with these kind of entities, you would want a protective sigil around you. What this does, interestingly enough, is that it prevents when Lucifer creates this circle around her and Sheriff Dirk in the jail cell, it prevents the gray man from being able to see them. So, and the idea of sight, the idea of knowledge behind sight, is a theme that runs throughout this particular issue, whether it's good or bad. The gray man, who we get very little of personality-wise, it's sort of a return to the Lovecraftian idea of something alien and foreign to us. The gray man never speaks English. He only speaks, I believe it's Portuguese. And we don't understand so much its motivation, except in little messages that it leaves behind in the blood of its victims, which says, which makes reference to this knife. So we come to find that this is what he's looking for, because this is how he's going to be able to call up his boss, Cthulhu. But he is unable to get to Lucifer and to Sheriff Dirk because of this protective circle. One thing I would like to interject at this point is that it is about this point in one of the comics where I can't say it's the first time I noticed it, but it's the first time I recognized that there was a repetitive pattern of the presence of a little girl in the background of different panels throughout the entire series. It's sort of unobtrusive. It's the kind of thing you might not even notice the first time reading through. But there's this little red-haired girl. Sometimes she's shown in a yellow dress. Sometimes it's a white dress. And she shows up in various panels, either in the police station. It's usually panels where there's a crowd of people, hospitals, the police station, crowds outside, where this little girl is present. And for the most part, for the first 5.5 issues, she's not explained. So it's once you notice it, then you can't unsee it. It's almost like the Where's Waldo of these comics here, where you continue to see this little girl without her being explained. And it's a little bit creepy because you understand that there is probably some significance to her, but we're not sure what it is yet. We also have a return to the Dreamlands. Okay, both Lucifer and Sheriff Dirk develop unique relationships with the harlot. And I have mentioned in past episodes that the harlot is one of my favorite characters. She is one of the few goddesses at all. And again, she's probably more like a demigoddess, but she's one of the few female demigoddesses. And she has a lot of power and a lot of agency. There are two kinds of power for women. And I believe this to be true. And I'm treading lightly here because I don't want to sound sexist, but women have always approached power one of two ways. They either approach it like a man and try to replicate how men display power, which has varying results, or women approach power the way women have power. And women have historically and traditionally always had power through use of their sexuality and through use of communication and a lot of moving parts. That's how the latter is how the harlot displays power. She is a keeper of secrets. She divulges certain information to certain people at the right time in the right place in order to orchestrate events in her favor. And she uses a certain degree of sexuality as both a tool of seduction and fear. So we have a visit to her. What we see is a conflict between her and Lucifer. And we find out that Lucifer did something to the harlot years ago, which the harlot has not forgiven. And what it ultimately ends up being is that she stole one of the harlot's boxes. And this is significant later on in this particular part of the series. But in order to interact with the harlot and have the harlot help them, the harlot always extracts a certain price from whoever it is. What is interesting here is that often what the harlot does is she takes something away from the person who wants information, wants knowledge in exchange for something. The harlot takes a piece of them. In Lucifer's case, the trade-off, the punishment, is that the harlot gives her something. And this is, again, where this theme of sight comes in. She dunks Lucifer in this well, and when she pulls Lucifer out, Lucifer can see a lot. She can see everything. She can see all of the carnage and all of the hatred for like thousands and thousands of years. It would be enough to drive most people insane. But what she does is that she punishes her with the sight that gods have. And I think that's sort of an interesting thing, because in a lot of Lovecraftian stories, the main goal is that kind of sight. It goes beyond second sight. It's like omnipotent sight. And the knowledge that is contained in that sight, in that being able to see that far into the past and future, the knowledge that is gained behind it. In this particular case, though, it's used as a punishment because, as I mentioned last week, even the gods understand that every power they have is also a burden, that you can't have one without the other. You can't have the good side of a godlike power without having the negative side of it as well. But what she comes to understand is that the... and what we also do have is we also have Sheriff Dirk's relationship with the harlot. He's given a drug to access the dream world, which again I think is kind of interesting because a lot of shamanistic and pagan occult practices of accessing other realms, other planes of existence, and of accessing the dreamland in particular, or the other world or the underworld, involve the use of substances which allow you to be in a trance-like enough state to access the doorways to these worlds. And that's kind of the situation going on here. You're not really sure at first if he's tripping or not, but basically Sheriff Dirk is given a drug that opens the doorway to the dreamlands, and he runs into the harlot as well. He has a very different kind of relationship. The harlot, because he's a man, the harlot is all over him, more or less, trying to seduce him, trying to keep him in one of her boxes. But he's not falling for this. He's not having any of this nonsense. He does want an exchange of information. She knows where the knife is being kept, because what happens is the ceremonial knife, after it killed Sai's girlfriend, it was entered into evidence with the police, and then at some point was stolen from the evidence room. So now it's in the wind, and Sheriff Dirk knows that he needs to find it. He and Lucifer need to find it before the Cthulhu cult finds it. So in the Dreamlands, he asks the harlot, because she knows everything. She knows everybody's secrets. But she wants to take something from him in return. And when he wakes up, he's not sure at first what it is that she took, because he still has all his fingers and toes. He still has all his body parts that he's supposed to have. What we come to find is that what she took from him, again, was sight, except it's a different kind of sight. It's the sight of memories, so that when he sees memories of his ex-wife, who was killed in a car accident years before, he doesn't recognize her. And so all of those memories of love and joy and everything else they've all been taken away from him. We have a theme throughout this, and this is kind of, I think, what sums up this particular series of issues in this part nicely, is this idea of nihilism versus human idealism in Lovecraftian work as opposed to modern cosmic horror. And this is where I think in these graphic novels it comes together, this blending of actual Lovecraftian themes with modern cosmic horror themes, is this idea that nothing you do really matters in the end, because these gods are so big and powerful that when they come back, they're just going to destroy everything. So any act of life or death or heroism or love or anything else is really irrelevant. And this is what the harlot tries to explain to Sheriff Dirk, that you want information to catch a murderer, to catch one murderer. What difference will that make when the gods come back and everybody is murdered. Like, who cares about one murder? Which, in a way makes sense. I mean, this is how the gods see it. This is how the demigods see it. And I think it's an interesting idea that the deities of this world are nihilists, which is in itself kind of terrifying. This idea that the gods don't have a sense of right or wrong or love or honor or anything else, really. I mean, and what they do display, as we talked about last episode, is somewhat superficial and subject to change on a whim. So there is that sense of nihilism, but there's also a sense of human idealism, because the sheriff believes it is important. It is important to catch murderers, because it is important to make the death of victims significant, to make it have meaning. And it's also important to catch murderers because it reinforces the idea that life matters, that human life matters and should be taken seriously. So when the harlot says to him, in the end, the lives you save won't matter. None of it will matter. The sheriff replies, yes, it will. It has to. And I think that neatly sums up what, the main struggle is in modern cosmic horror and in modern Lovecraftian horror, is this idea that we have a nihilistic, almost impossible situation, an almost unwinnable situation. Honestly, if all three of these gods were to rise and fight, what chance would humanity have? So why is it worth even stopping it? But it's worth stopping it because humans continuously, and I believe, heroically, will continue to reinforce the idea that human lives matter, that fighting for people you love, fighting for the ideals that define the psyche of the best of us, is worth it. It's worth the fight, whether you win or not. That is almost irrelevant. It's the idea that the fight matters, that the point you're making matters. So that's it for this week. Next week, we will be taking on part 4. And ideally, if we can cover 5 and 6, we may be able to do that for the rest of the year. And then in January, we're going to start with new kinds of content and maybe some more conspiracy stuff and cosmic horror in the real world, cosmic horror in music, art, and of course, cosmic horror in literature and pop culture. And so I look forward to it. If you enjoyed this podcast, you may also enjoy another podcast that I am on, The Horror Show with Brian Keene. Both Cosmic Shenanigans, past, present, and future, as well as The Horror Show with Brian Keene, can be found on Project Entertainment Network, iTunes, which I believe is now Apple Radio. Apple, you'll find it. Just look for it. You can also find it on iHeartRadio, and I'm sorry, there's people gesturing at me in the background, and I don't know what they're talking about.
I was going to suggest you plug sound engineer Matt Wildeson's book, Horrors Untold.
I didn't get to that yet. I do the whole podcast thing.
Hi, folks.
This is Brian Keene, by the way. We're recording in his studio. But yes, please do buy, if you like cosmic horror, please do buy engineer Matt Wildeson's new book, Horrors Untold. Check out his podcast, Grindcast. You would enjoy both of them because they're both lots of fun. And also, we have some progress on our engineer Dave Thomas. He is, still going through treatments. He's finishing up some treatments and preparing for others. If you could donate to his GoFundMe, we would very much appreciate it. If you go to the GoFundMe and you put in Dave Thomas, you will find it. It's fairly easy to find, and just donate whatever you can, even if it's only $1. Every little bit helps. We would really appreciate it. So thank you, folks, and I will see you next week. Bye.
There Shall Come a podcast like no other. Defenders Dialogue. Marvel Comics' original superhero non-team convenes once again. Comic book writers and authors Brian Keene and Christopher Golden take us back to the 70s and 80s as they discuss Marvel's most dynamic collection of superheroes, Defenders Dialogue with Brian Keene and Christopher Golden, Tuesdays exclusively on Project Entertainment Network.